Using the player. Toggle the menu button. Using the player. Toggle the menu button to see where you are in the training and to jump to any specific section. Toggle the Notes button to see the notes for each slide. Use the magnifying glass to search for specific text within the unit. Toggle the hamburger to display slides full screen and to reveal or hide the menu and notes. The Resources button in the top left contains helpful links to documentation and websites. Control the player volume at the bottom of your screen next to the Play button. Continuing along the bottom of your screen, you can also reload a slide and move to previous and next slides using the buttons in the lower right-hand corner. This is an extensive, challenging course that presents essential concepts you need to learn about Magento 2.3. It assumes that you have prior experience with Magento and highlights changes in features and functionality. To successfully complete this course, we recommend that you have a minimum of 6 months' experience with Magento, a general understanding of UI components, and knowledge of JavaScript in Magento 2. To increase your comprehension and retention of the material, there are some easy but important steps you should take as you progress through the course. Have your Magento 2 installation open while you take the course. Look up the references suggested in the notes. Study the code examples in the slides and notes, explore the code, and complete the exercises when presented in the course. This is an important step in reinforcing your knowledge of the topic just completed. Be sure to click the buttons below to download the virtual machine for fundamentals, and, if you need it, there is also a VM installation guide and VM installation video to help you get through the process. Fundamentals of Magento 2 Development, Part 2. In Unit 1, we will discuss UI components, including an introduction to UI components, architecture and configuration, templates and rendering, and JavaScript's role in UI components. Section 1. Introduction to UI components. UI components use PHP primarily to generate data. They use JavaScript for component rendering and functioning. Some examples of UI components are shown on the slide. In Magento 2, UI components also use PHP, but primarily for generating data for the component. The most important aspects of component rendering and functioning are done in JavaScript. In this course, we will discuss JavaScript only as it relates to UI component architecture and the back end. UI components are reusable elements, pieces of an interface, generated and managed by JavaScript. These components implement the rendering on the front end concept. This table presents similarities and differences between UI components and blocks. As you can see, blocks and UI components have one thing in common. They both implement block interface, which means they use the toHTML method. UI components have their own templates, XHTML and HTML files, while blocks use PHTML templates. Special classes generate data for UI components, while blocks serve as the data containers themselves. Also, UI components have their own configuration files, while there are no configuration files for blocks, other than layout. And, as mentioned earlier, UI components are rendered by JavaScript, while blocks are rendered by PHP. Architecture and configuration. And differences between UI components and blocks. As you can see, blocks and UI components have one thing in common. They both implement block interface, which means they use the toHTML method. UI components have their own templates, XHTML and HTML files, while blocks use PHTML templates. Special classes generate data for UI components, while blocks serve as the data containers themselves. Also, UI components have their own configuration files, while there are no configuration files for blocks, other than layout. And, as mentioned earlier, UI components are rendered by JavaScript, while blocks are rendered by PHP. Architecture and configuration. As shown on this diagram, every UI component has to extend UI component interface. You can also see two types of UI components, form elements and other specific component, extending abstract component. On the slides that follow, we will examine UI component interface and abstract component in more detail. Review the UI component interface methods displayed on your screen. Abstract UI component. Here are the key responsibilities for the Abstract UI component class. Its methods can be divided into three groups, as shown on the slide. Their content is quite straightforward. Take a few minutes to explore this class in your installation. This slide displays key classes involved in component rendering. They are presented here at a high level. Each component usually contains a context object. These objects encapsulate other objects and data that the component might need. Usually, components are hierarchical, so we have a root component and its children, for example, a grid and columns, filters, etc., a form and elements. The root component usually starts with an XHTML template, which can be compiled in PHP. This process is initiated by the toHTML method. A further rendering process then continues on the JavaScript side. The data for a component is provided by two special classes, data source and data provider. At a high level, there is a definition file and files that are specific to each UI component. Definition files contain basic information about the components that exist in a system. Specific component configuration files extend definitions by adding relevant information about a component, its data source, children, and so on. There are multiple configuration files used in the component's lifecycle. This is the syntax for the definition XML file. The file consists of nodes, whose name is a name of the component. Each node has a class attribute, which is an instance of a PHP components class, and component attribute, which has a path to the JavaScript component. Inside a node, there are two types of subnodes, argument and settings. Both will set config values for the component. For simplicity's sake, we will skip the subtle underlying details of how they work, and just state that both will end up with a config value for a component. There is another file, definition.map.xml. It contains mapping from the old syntax based on an argument node to a new syntax based on settings, which is more straightforward. Each UI component created with the full cycle may have different instances. For example, We may have a listing component which represents a grid. However, grids could be different. They might have different fields, different filters, different data, and so on. So each exact grid would be a component's interface, and it would have its own specific configuration, which defines which data provider class to use, what's the primary ID field, and so on. These instance XML files are usually named using the name of the entity plus the name of the component. For example, for a product, it would be product_listing.xml. That rule is not strict, and you are able to call your instance file whatever you like. In the instance file, we specify data source, data provider configuration, children, and some specific settings. This also means that you may define other definition.xml or product_listing.xml files. Just put them in the right place in your module, and Magento will merge with the core files. This gives you an ability to customize native configurations. To include a properly configured components instance on the page, Magento Layout has a special directive, UI component name equals instance name. This will do the entire job for you. Render the XHTML template, config, call Magento UI JS Core app, and so on. The UI component framework uses the following approach in dealing with data. Every component has a data source subcomponent, which delivers data. While it may seem like a data subcomponent should be independent of the original component, so other components on the page could also use the data, a data component almost always has its own data source, which provides data exclusively to it. The hierarchy for the data source component is depicted in the slide. As you know, each component should have its own PHP class. For the data source, there is the interface data source interface, which every data source implementation has to implement. The UI component data source commonly extends abstract component. The data source does not actually contain data. Instead, it obtains data from data provider, the class that is responsible for data. For example, for the grid UI component, its data provider will wrap the collection with data. Usually, components are composite. For example, form has elements, grid has filters, and so on. A component's JavaScript is usually aware of its children and knows how to render them. It is important that the two HTML and therefore render PHP methods are only executed for the original root component and compile the XHTML template. Everything else, including subcomponent rendering, is in JavaScript using the Knockout Templates engine and HTML templates. See your exercises guide for instructions on how to complete this exercise and the solution. Templates and rendering. As displayed on the slide, there are two types of templates used in UI components: XHTML and HTML templates. XHTML is a template for the root component and is rendered in PHP. HTML is an actual template rendered in JavaScript using the Knockout Templates engine. The code on this slide displays the getTemplate method implementation, which is defined in the abstract component. As you can see, it always adds an XHTML extension to the file. The XHTML template is used as a container where JavaScript will be inserted to render the component and its children. Here you can see a code example of the XHTML template declaration in the definition.xml file. And finally, the XHTML file itself. This particular example is Magento UI View Base UI Component Templates Form Default XHTML. You can see it contains div containers. Elements contained within the curly braces are what the Magento compiler will process. There are two types of elements that could be included in the braces. One is a component's method, the method of a corresponding component's PHP class, and the other is a variable. In addition to processing the double brace contents, a JavaScript element with component configuration, data, and modules will be generated and inserted at the bottom of the file. Note the comment in brown, KO template get template. This will be processed by the knockout template and will use an HTML file as the template. This slide shows how an HTML template could be declared in a component's XML. The template file declared in the configuration can be found at Magento UI View Base Web Templates Grid Filters Field.html. Note that the template item should be inside a config element. This slide presents a high-level diagram of the rendering process. Note that this diagram only includes PHP rendering, which results in XHTML file processing. The real rendering is conducted by JavaScript. Usually, when working with a UI component, you won't interact with the classes depicted, compiler, template engine, so they will not be covered in detail in this course. GetName. The PHP compiler parses all statements contained within the double curly brackets and only executes corresponding methods or obtains required variables. GetTemplate. The Knockout Templates engine will obtain a real components template, or HTML file, based on the scope. Here we can see exactly what the Magento compiler does with the XHTML template. It processes all the double curly bracket statements. Every statement is either a call to a method of the UI components class or to a variable. Note that the getTemplate is not inside of double curly brackets, so it will not be processed by PHP. It will be processed by the Knockout Templates engine when a page is loaded into the browser. This slide shows us the result of an XHTML compilation, which is delivered to the browser. As you can see, there are no double curly bracket statements, but there is still getTemplate. Pay particular attention to the script code at the bottom. This lengthy line of JavaScript includes configuration of the component, its children, and the data exported from the data provider. See your course exercise guide for instructions on how to complete this exercise and the solution. JavaScript's role in UI components. Now we will take a brief look at the UI component JavaScript. This is a very complex topic and requires a deep knowledge of JavaScript, which is beyond the scope of this course. UI component is a special type of a module that has its own structure and uses its own JavaScript subframework, which we call a UI framework. We do offer specific training for working with JavaScript in Magento. See your Resources tab for links to the Magento U website. Usually, UI components are executed in a special way by passing a configuration object to the Magento UI JS Core App module. The slide shows an example of executing a customer's component, Magento Customer JS View Customer. This code from Magento UI View Base Web JS Grid Listing.js is an example of the listing component's JavaScript. Note some of the elements of the UI component JavaScript framework, such as UI layout, UI collection, and so on. Typically, UI component JavaScript returns an extension of either a UI collection or UI element object. Use the scroll bar to view all the code. This slide describes key steps that must be taken to get UI components executed and rendered on the page. This code from Magento, UI, Vue, Base, Web, JS, Grid, Listing.js is an example of the listing components JavaScript. This is a small portion of the product listing UI components execution script from the product's grid page. Please take the time to visit that page and examine all the related JavaScript and its structure. You will notice it is a huge amount of JavaScript, including both data and configuration. It is very important to focus on the JS execution itself. You will see that it is executed through a special module, Magento UI JS Core App. This module is used to execute UI component JavaScript and differs greatly from the other UI component JavaScript modules. See your course exercise guide for instructions on how to complete this exercise and the solution. Congratulations! You have completed Unit 1 of Fundamentals of Magento 2 Development, Part 2. Unit 2, Grids and Forms. In this unit, we will discuss the grids and forms in the Magento admin architecture. Introduction to Grids. Here you can see what a grid looks like in Magento. Grid is a UI component that represents a list of records for a specific entity. The first thing to notice is the filtering function. In Magento, filters are separated from the data. You can also see other element areas: buttons, mass actions, paging, sorting, and data. Grid is a UI component rendered by JavaScript. A developer only has to configure it properly. Grids in Magento 2 have many new functions, which will be covered in more detail in the Grid module that follows. Grids fulfill a number of important functions, such as rendering a list of records for a particular entity, providing an ability to sort, filter, and search in an efficient way through a list of records, allowing execution of certain events on a group of records, for example, activate, deactivate, delete. As mentioned earlier, a grid is a UI component in Magento, so it should be enabled using the UI component layout directive. This diagram presents a list of the various grid components. Listing, a central UI component that represents the grid itself. Columns, a component that includes a set of column components. Each column component represents a specific grid column and its data. Columns are now rendered in JavaScript. Filters, a complete component that includes a set of filter components. The diagram displays which native filter components are available in a native Magento installation. Paging, a component responsible for rendering paging. Mass actions, a component that renders a mass actions drop-down menu with a list of possible actions appropriate to a subset of a grid's records. The listing component is a component that has a group of children to facilitate its features. A component that still works with collections through the data provider. Note that this may change in future releases. On the slide, you can see a code demonstration of the listing configuration from a definition XML file. It contains the UI component class, Magento UI component listing, and the root template, templates listing default.xhtml. The template is generic and used like a container. All real rendering occurs by using HTML templates and JavaScript. In this code, you can see an example from the CMS module that demonstrates arguments a listing can use. JS_config settings/deps arguments. It defines the configuration of JavaScript. The settings buttons argument specifies the list of buttons that can be added to the listing. Data source is a UI component that provides data to other components. As discussed earlier, data source requires data provider. Data provider is actually the class which obtains data. It has to implement a specific interface to provide JSON data to data source. You usually implement your own data provider for an instance of a UI component. Here we see a code demonstration of the listing configuration from a definition XML file. There are two commonly used UI components available in Magento 2. Two of them, listing and form, are composite and contain a set of child components. Data source is also a UI component that provides data to all of them. Data needs to be taken from the database. But data source is a JavaScript module, so it uses data provider, which is a PHP class, to generate data for data source. The code on the slide demonstrates configuration for the data source component in the definition XML file. Abstract Data Provider is a class that every data provider has to extend. Its key method, getData, has to be implemented. On the slide, you can see an example of this type of implementation. The getData method returns data from a collection. This is typical of grids. Their data provider classes usually only wrap collection classes, which extract data from the database. Note that there is another abstract data provider available: Magento, Framework, View, Element, UI Component, Data Provider, Data Provider. Those classes are used in different places in the core code. Here is an example of the data source component configuration for product listing. You can see that it defines the data provider class. Usually, the data provider class is defined for each implementation of a UI component. Data sources usually have a name composed of two parts, instance_name and _data_source. This is an important naming convention as it is used in the code. The listing's name, product_listing, data source, would have the data source name, product_listing_data_source. The component attribute of a data source node is a JS class that loads data itself. Usually it is a standard component for all grids, although you can set your own. Magento_UI JS grid provider. Next parameter, data scope, defines the data scope, which is store in this example and is used inside of the provider's JS module. Next parameter, update URL. Usually it is set to a default MUI index reindex generic URL. The data provider configuration is a PHP configuration, not JavaScript. It defines which PHP class has to generate data. It is important to note that the default provider's JS component Magento UI grid provider expects to receive data in a certain format, so data provider has to facilitate that. Data provider's name has to be the same as data source's name. This slide shows an implementation of Data Provider for the product_listing UI component. As you can see, GetData loads a collection and creates an array with total records and items elements. The Data Source Catalog Data Provider implements three methods: GetData, AddField, AddFilter. You can also see a couple of other methods in the code. For example, AddFilter. It is just a wrapper around collection filtering. Let's find out how the data provider works. Starting from the argument tag, which is also important, the Magento 2 provider item passed in data initiates data source. The provider value computergameslisting.computergameslisting data source has two parts. The first part, computergameslisting, is the name of the UI component, and the second part, computergameslisting data source, is the name of the data source which works with data on the server and makes the UI component work with this data. The data source tag defines the component responsible for initializing the data storage using a JavaScript module. This is Magento_UI JS grid provider, whose full path is Magento UI view base web JS grid provider.js. Next is the data provider subtag, which is configured in the UI component XML. We need to associate this name with a resource model using di.xml. Basically, it might be configured with one or two Magento UI Data Provider Abstract Data Provider, or from Magento Framework View Element UI Component Data Provider Data Provider. One important setting is update URL path equals MUI index render. An AJAX request will retrieve the data and encourage the component data to be updated. By default, it will be in JSON format and will be automatically installed in externalprovider.data. The next parameters are request field name, primary field name. Primary field name is related to the primary column of the database. Request field name is related to the variable in HTTP requests. The tag listing toolbar contains filters, bookmarks, full text search field, paging, columns, controls, mass actions, and other subtags. The columns tag contains a full list of columns to be rendered on the grid. Let's look at some columns defined in this tag. For example, release_date. The class attribute defines the PHP class which processes the data and settings of this element. The component attribute is responsible for rendering the column element via a JavaScript module. And finally, the special column type Actions column, which defines the PHP class responsible for editing and deleting the grid's items. For rendering, the columns listing component uses the same approach as with filters. There is a columns UI component that acts as a container, and a set of specific column UI components which render specific columns. In Magento, each column is a UI component, so it is configured in the component's XML file. It is important that EAV entities obtain information about columns automatically, although you can see column configuration in the product_listing.xml file. The columns UI component is defined in the definition.xml file. In the code on your screen, you can see the columns component with the corresponding class Magento UI component listing columns. That's the first highlighted code. And the column component with the class Magento UI component listing columns column. That's the second highlight in the code. This slide lists JavaScript modules that are responsible for rendering columns. Column.js is a JavaScript module that renders a column. Open the file and take a look at the constructor. You will see the following code. This code displays an example of column configuration in the CMS module, cms_page_listing.xml. This column is of the type select, so you can specify options. The options are set in the Magento CMS model page source isActive class. You can also see that the component that renders this column is select.js. Here is the code example for a non-visible column configuration that defines whether a column is rendered by default or not. It is possible because of the flexibility that JavaScript rendering provides. See your course exercise guide for instructions on how to complete this exercise and the solution. This slide shows the expanded filters feature. This interface opens when the filter button is clicked. Each filter is represented by its own input, which provides greater flexibility and the creation of more sophisticated filters. Having the filters separated means you can now have more filters than visible fields, and the inputs for the filters can be complex combinations. For example, on the image that you can see, name, SKU, and type. As filters are UI components, a list of available filters can be found in definition.xml. Filters are used to simplify searching through a list of records. They can also set limits to display only those records that meet a set of criteria set by the admin. This code snippet shows the filters UI component configuration in definition.xml. Note the filters UI component and the set filter component, filters, act as a container for all specific filters. You can also see the JavaScript module, which renders the UI component. How filters are applied depends upon the data provider implementation. The native data provider at Magento, Framework, View, Element, UI Component, Data Provider uses a filter pool object, which contains an apply filters method that does just that, applies filters. The configuration for this method and the other filters seen on this slide can be defined in the DI XML for a specific grid. As you can see from the second code snippet, the process goes through a list of registered appliers, which it uses to apply a filter. In general, the list of appliers is injected using DI. See your course exercise guide for instructions on how to complete this exercise and the solution. See your course exercise guide for instructions on how to complete this exercise and the solution. Mass actions are used to apply certain actions or events to a set of records. They define which actions are available on the grid page and list actions configured in the Data Config Actions argument. The Mass Actions dropdown can optionally be made available on a grid page. If so, it defines a list of actions that can be applied to a set of records from the grid. Conceptually, Mass Actions is a UI component, child of a listing. In this code example, you can see the generic configuration for Mass Actions defined in definition.xml. In that file, you can see the corresponding UI component class, Magento UI component Mass Action, and the JavaScript module responsible for rendering, massaction.js. Here is the configuration from a CMS page grid. You see the possible actions, delete, disable, along with corresponding URLs to send data, and possible confirmation messages. The Mass Action JavaScript module is responsible for rendering and executing actions on multiple rows, usually selected by a checkbox in the first column. See your course exercise guide for instructions on how to complete this exercise and the solution. In Magento, the Sales module contains a special set of tables designed for admin grids. These tables populate on the fly when an entity is saved. Depicted on the slide is a typical scheme for grid indexing. Grid indexing solves the problem of joining multiple tables, usually one main table and sets of related ones, in Magento. However, this can result in a large query that doesn't perform well. A solution is to populate a special grid table with the required data at the time of entity saving. This is a listing configuration for a sales order. As you can see, it uses an abstract data provider from the framework, not just from the Magento UI module, which is configured in the di.xml, as shown on the slide. This configuration from the Sales module di.xml file shows how grid tables are implemented for sales entities. It attaches special collection classes to data sources related to the sales entities. In some cases, Magento is using special tables for admin grids. Such tables consist of aggregated information that makes obtaining data for a grid a much easier procedure. A great example of this approach is sales grids. For example, in order to render the sales order grid, Magento has to gather information from multiple different sources, such as orders tables, addresses, and so on. What happens instead is that Magento will aggregate data needed for a grid on the fly and place it into separate tables, Sales Order Grid. This table will have its own collection and will be used to render the admin grid. See your course exercise guide for instructions on how to complete this exercise and the solution. You can see where the paging feature is situated. Paging is also a UI component. Its main responsibility is to display paging control options, like the number of records per page number, and page navigation. The paging component is used to render paging elements, such as next and previous pages, the current page, total number of records, and the set of closest next and previous page numbers. The code example shows paging configuration in the file, definition XML. As you can see, it is quite simple. Note that the JavaScript paging module is paging.js, located under the Magento UI module. On the slide, we have an example of paging configuration for the product grid. UI component, grid. Let's start from model, resource model, and collection classes for the entity. Here is the model file, app, code, unit 2, computer games, model, game.php. This model class extends the abstract model or abstract extensible model class. The construct method will be called when a model is instantiated. Next is the resource model class in app, code, unit 2, computer games, model, resource model, game.php. The resource model is executing SQL queries. Every resource model in Magento extends an abstract class called AbstractDB. This contains the functions for fetching information from the DB. One example is the model class. The resource model class required construct method. This method will call the init function to define the table name and the primary key for that table. Next, the collection class in app, code, unit 2, computer games, model, resource model, game, collection.php. The collection model is considered a resource model, which lets you filter and fetch collection table data. Collection class extends abstract collection and implements search result interface. We need model, resource model, and resource model collection to manage data in the table. And finally, the table to store the entity records needs to be defined in a dbschema.xml file. Also, we need to define the entry in the admin menu that will link to the page with the grid. Add a file, app, code, unit 2, computer games, etc, admin.html, menu.xml. When it's done and the cache has been flushed, the new menu entry should already be visible in the admin menu. Backend route. Two things are required to add a new admin route. First, the route needs to be created. Second, create the action controller. To configure the backend route, add a file, app, code, unit 2, computer games, etc, admin.html, routes.xml. Now we need to create the backend action class that will process the request here. Unit 2, computer games, controller, admin.html, game, index. The admin resource class constant is set to the ACL resource ID specified in the etc acl.xml file. Access to admin accounts in select parts of the admin area can be granted through an ACL access control list. When creating a new page in the admin area, a new ACL resource should be created at the same time. To do this, create the file. See your course exercise guide for instructions on how to complete this exercise and the solution. See your course exercise guide for instructions on how to complete this exercise and the solution. Introduction to Forms. Here is an example of the form back-end interface. A form in Magento 2 is a framework which creates effective user interfaces for managing different entities. Almost all back-end interfaces are built from forms and grids. A form container's main goal is to display actions applicable to the whole form. For example, save or delete. The Form UI Components PHP class is Magento UI Component Form. Its most important function is to obtain data. See the code on your screen or in your notes. As you can see, it checks whether the ID parameter is set, and if so, adds a primary key filter. As you can see in the Data Provider customer example, Magento UI Component Form extends Abstract Component. This code shows how the form component is defined in the file definition.xml. From this XML code, you can see that the components code is located in Magento, UI, View, Base, Web, JS, Form, Form.js, and the default template in Magento, UI, View, Base, UI Component, Templates, Form, Default.xhtml. This example demonstrates how to configure a list of buttons. Each button is defined by an item element. Its corresponding value is a Magento block that represents the required button. For the back button, it represents a typical button example. As you analyze the code, you will see that getButtonData returns an array of button configuration data like label, onClick handler, CSS class, and sort order. GetBackURL is an example of button-specific functionality. For example, delete button includes getDeleteURL. Continuing the code example, button implements button provider, which is Magento, Framework, View, Element, UI Component, Control, Button, Provider Interface. Note the additional button properties included in the data attribute element of the getButtonData result. Here is an example for a data provider definition for a customer form. Data source and data provider provide structure for a form, like a grid. Form uses another class for data provider, Magento UI JS Form Provider, and usually another PHP class for providing data. Some key points about Magento 2's Forms Data Provider. It extends Magento UI Data Provider Abstract Data Provider. It implements the getData method, which generates data for the customer and customers' addresses. It uses EAV attributes metadata. FieldSet is a container component which renders its children, form elements. The diagram presents a typical form structure. Each form consists of one or more field sets, and each field set consists of a group of fields. Here is the original definition of a field set as a UI component. As you can see, it is a pretty standard UI component that is implemented in a Magento UI View. The FieldSet Components PHP class extends Abstract Component. This class is almost empty. FieldSet configuration should be done in the Form XML file. Here we can see a customer form configuration example. This form has many field sets, with each field set encapsulating field elements. As we can see here, FieldSet configuration consists of a data argument and a set of field nodes. Each node includes field configuration, which will be described in the slides that follow. The role of a container is to group multiple fields inside of a field set. The next slide provides an example of when containers could be useful. You can see two fields grouped here, the drop-down General and the checkbox Disable Automatic Group Change based on VAT ID. Both are contained within the same label, Group. This piece of XML code defines a group, the same as shown on the FieldSets interface diagram on the previous slide. You can see it includes two fields and a set of parameters on the data argument. This code demonstrates a declaration of a container UI component definition in definition.xml. Here is an example of a container PHP class. As you can see, it is relatively trivial. This diagram presents the most important form elements. You can find the full list in the definition.xml file. The slide shows a list of data types. Note that data type does not explicitly define control, but rather how real data is related to a certain field. Click to the next slide to review an example of the code for an abstract data type class. Here is an abstract data type class. As you can see, it is relatively trivial. Here we can see how form elements are defined in the definition.xml file. There are three important elements to note. Component PHP class, Magento UI, component, form, element, input. JavaScript module, Magento _UI, JS, form, element, abstract. Template, UI, form, field. A generic field template wraps an elements template with auxiliary components like before-after triggers. You can review the corresponding code on your screen. This code presents an example of an Elements template using input.html, which was included in the definition.xml slide shown earlier. As you can see, it is a knockout template composed of certain data, value, name, ID, that are inserted using the generic UI component engine. The slide shows an example of real input from a field declaration for the customer module. Note the two major configuration options that define the template's look and feel. They are highlighted: data type and form element. Another example, this time for the select field. You can see more configuration options in this example, such as validation, which defines the CSS class used for validation, and tooltip, which shows a message on mouse over. Note that data type for select type fields defines the type of select values. The image element is a little different from a regular form element. It has some specific configuration options shown on the slide. The image form element requires a URL which will physically store the image on the server. On the slide, you can see an example of the image uploader in the catalog module, category_form.xml. Some configuration elements were obtained for better understanding. Note, the most important elements are highlighted. UI component, form, new edit save, action controllers. From the grid, you may see the button Add New Game on the top right, which will forward us to the form. App, Code, Unit 2, Computer Games, Controller, Admin HTML, Game, Edit.php. This is quite common, since adding a new entity and editing an existing one is usually done using similar forms. To save form, we have the Save Action Controller. App, Code, Unit 2, Computer Games, Controller, Admin HTML, Game, Save.php. The Save Action Controller extends the Magento Backend App Action class, which then implements the execute method from Magento Framework App Action Interface class and saves all the data from the form. The Layout XML and UI component configuration for the form page. First, the Layout XML. This file needs to be created at App, Code, Unit 2, Computer Games, View, Admin HTML, Layout, games_game_edit.xml. Here we need to add a component in Magento Layout as a node. It's UI component with the name of our UI form. Next, the form UI component configuration has to be created right next to the grid UI component configuration file in the directory. App, Code, Unit 2, Computer Games, View, Admin HTML, UI_component. The UI component file references a group of classes that represent buttons and a data source with data provider, field sets with fields. The argument tag is also important. The Magento 2 provider item passed in data initiates data source. The provider value, computergamesform.gameFormDataSource, has two parts. The first is computergamesform. It is the name of the UI component. And the second part, GameFormDataSource is the name of the data source that works data on the server and makes the UI component work with this data. Deps sets the dependency on component initialization. The data source tag defines the component responsible for initializing the data storage using a JavaScript module. This is Magento_UI JS form provider, of which the full path is Magento UI view base web JS form provider.js. The configuration of the data source itself, in simple words, defines the links between the form and database. The data provider subtag is configured in the UI component XML. Basically, it could be configured with Magento UI data provider abstract data provider. We can see it in our form data class here. It should implement the data method. Field set. Here we have one field set named General. The field set component implements a container for visually grouped form elements, and a set of fields such as game_ID, name, type, trial_period, release_date, image, and so on. Let's check trial_period as an example. Name. Elements index in the scope of the current collection that will be used to build its unique identifier. Form element could be hidden, file, input, date, checkbox, checkbox set, email, select, multi-select, text, text area, price, radio set, WYSIWYG. The default is input. For example, trial_period field has trial_period as an identifier and form element has select. This field has a pretty straightforward set of configurations of arguments and settings, which Magento uses a lot in UI components and depends on our form element. For example, select Image Uploader in the Image field. But how do we add options in the Select field type? For that we need a Form Elements node, where we specified a Form Element node, Select, and define options for the form element. For this we need an Options node, where a PHP class is defined. This class should implement Magento, Framework, Data, Option Source Interface, Interface class, and two-option array method with options in the format on your screen. UI component Image Uploader. To create an image or file uploader, we need to start from adding new fields to the UI form with the form element Image Uploader component. If we check the definition.xml file in the UI module, we will see that we have an exact Image Uploader form element which has the basic class Magento UI component form element data type media image. Next to it is a basic JS component, Magento_UI JS form element image-uploader. In other words, this is a JS module in Magento 2 and template UI form element uploader image. Be sure to take a look at these. They could be very useful to know in your day-to-day work. Now we need to create a controller which we define in uploader config of the form UI component. Param xsi:type equals string, name equals URL, game/game_file_uploader/save. Basically, this is a regular controller which extends a Magento backend app action class. The most important part here is to instantiate Image Uploader model. Basically, we are using Image Uploader from the catalog module. And in the execute method of our controller, we need to define a basic logic of image saving and save data to the TMP directory. The image uploader is a bit abstract. It can be used to upload images of files basically anywhere. It does have a path and a defined temporary path, basic path, and allowed extensions for uploading images. You can create a virtual type based on it and use it. If you want an image or file uploader for the UI component form, you can do this by adding it to the etc admin.html di.xml file of your module file. After that, you need to tell Magento that the following controllers and UI component classes, namely save, image modifier, and listing column images, uses this virtual type to upload the file. This instance of the virtual type is basically an instance of our game images, but with base temp path, base path, and allowed extensions such as JPEG, GIF, and PNG. Let's consider an image modifier from our virtual type name equals Games Image Uploader UI Data Provider Image Form Modifier Pool. Type Magento UI Data Provider Modifier Pool. So, here we need to implement a modifier interface and two methods, modify meta and modify data method. This is a very important part of preparing a meta information of the image for the data provider. Then later, in Data Provider class, we need to instantiate Pool Interface to modify data and prepare it to correctly save the image path. Let's consider a game save controller. This is also basically a regular controller that extends the Magento backend. App Action Class. And the most important part here is to check that you have image. And if so, move this from the temporary directory to the constant directory. And save the image name to the database. See your course exercise guide for instructions on how to complete this exercise and the solution. See your course exercise guide for instructions on how to complete this exercise and the solution. See your course exercise guide for instructions on how to complete this exercise and the solution. Congratulations! You have completed Fundamentals of Magento 2 Development Part 2. Click the Next button or simply close out of this window to return to the Learning System.